Hello, in this lecture you'll learn a bit about the connection strings. Now what a connection string is, it's basically a string of key and value pairs, a string of certain properties that will be implemented in the connection to the database. So it is read by some program that you have, whatever programming language you're using, you will be using a connection string. So you have a connection string and therefore you connect to the database. Now it contains user, password and some other stuff. We will look into that later. But before that, let's create another login. Let's do. So let's expand logins so you don't have to expand them actually. And right click on that again, new login. And let's do languages. Languages user because we will be using this connection with the different languages. And then you do SQL Server Authentication, no enforcement on password policy. And then let's do password TSD, or you could do something else. And now again, let's go through those important steps once again. You do user mapping, you map to the test database, and then you need to assign DB data reader and then also DB data writer, because we will be writing some data. So then you click OK and you should be good to go, but you only know that when you actually make that connection, which we will do in the later lectures. Now let's try to actually establish that string. And what I would do, I would simply open up a text editor. Whatever text editor you prefer, you could have those sticky notes on your desktop, whichever works for you. So I have my notepad. And so I will start with the connection string. I will put it in quotation marks just so I could copy it. And then I will start with the very first thing, which is always gonna be there, and that is the data source. Data source equals, and data source is basically the server, the computer that you are accessing. And with that, the SQL server part of that whole system that you are accessing. So let's do the local host. So first of all, you need the IP address. So obviously if you had a remote connection, you would put in that remote IP. But if you do it locally, you simply enter the local IP, which is 127.0.0.1. And then you use comma to separate something, and that something is the port. Now, we looked at the ports in the setup lecture, and usually the default port is 1433. 1433, 1433. That is the default port, and if you remember, you had to select some options, open up some ports. So you do that always, and you leave this default port always there. You could change it, but I would not recommend it. And then you need to put in a backslash, and you need to write the name of the instance of the SQL server. So in this case, I'm using SQL Server Express. So I will write SQL Express. Now, in your case, it might be something different. It might be some other name. So you decide on that, and you can actually change this as well, but I would not recommend doing that. It's always better to go with defaults. Now, after that, you need this thing called initial catalog, which will be your database that you are actually connecting to. Now, you don't necessarily need to use that, but it is a lot easier to work with stored procedures when you have that initial catalog. You don't need to deal with several databases then. You have one connection for one database, and also that gives some extra layer of security. So let's do initial catalog like that equals, and we have our database test database 1, test database 1. Just like that, we have 2 parts of our connection ready. Now there will be 2 or 3 more parts of the connection. It would depend on your arrangement. So I'm not gonna get into that, but we will now go through 2 parts, the authentication part, so that is the user ID and the password. So let's do user ID equals, and what was it? Language user we had. So that's our ID, user ID, and then we go to the password. So you write password equals TST, just like that. And then finally, now again, you may not need this. It depends on your arrangement. We won't get into that. It's not really important, but I would suggest doing this. So you have trusted connection equals true. On servers you usually won't have to do that, but on your computer you do need to do that. So now we have this little connection string, and again there are several different types of the connection strings, but we will start with this one. This will be used for C# data handling. So this will work perfectly. So we have the source, which is the IP, the port, and the SQL Server instance. And then you have initial catalog, which is basically the database, and then you have user ID, password, and then trusted connection, true. So with that, we will conclude this lecture.